Hollywood has invented countless historical facts over the years, turning real events into thrilling myths. But what happens when these fabrications influence the way we view history? The truth is, these fictions don't just entertain, they distort our understanding, mislead us, and even manipulate our perceptions of the past. In this video, we're revealing 45 historical facts that Hollywood completely made up and showing you the real cost of these distortions. Get ready for the truth behind the silver screen. Chapter 1: The Battle of Stirling Bridge, Braveheart, and the Heroic Fiction. In Braveheart, the Battle of Stirling Bridge is portrayed as an epic clash, with William Wallace leading a chaotic charge. But the truth? The real battle was far more strategic. Wallace didn't storm the battlefield in a grand charge. Instead, the Scots used the narrow bridge to trap the English forces, cutting them off and forcing a surrender. The key to their success wasn't a battle of brute force, but brilliant tactics, something Hollywood completely ignored in favor of dramatic spectacle. But this wasn't just a minor tweak. It was a deliberate rewrite of military history, turning a well-thought-out strategy into an emotional, romanticized fight for freedom. Hollywood turned Wallace into a heroic symbol of rebellion, when the truth is, his victory was more about clever positioning than heroic bloodshed. Chapter 2: Cleopatra. Cleopatra and the Myth of Beauty. Hollywood's portrayal of Cleopatra is a classic case of fiction over fact. In the 1963 film Cleopatra, she is depicted as a seductive, glamorous woman who captured the hearts of Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. But the reality? Cleopatra was far more than just a pretty face. She was a brilliant strategist, a political mastermind who fought to keep Egypt a powerful force in a world dominated by Rome. This fabrication oversimplifies her legacy, reducing her to a one-dimensional figure of beauty and lust, completely ignoring her role as a savvy ruler who spoke multiple languages and navigated complex political landscapes. Hollywood turned her into a symbol of romanticized power, but in truth, her life was about intellect, diplomacy, and survival in a cutthroat world. And this distortion wasn't just a small inaccuracy, it shaped how generations saw one of the most powerful women in history. Chapter 3: The American Revolution. The Patriot and the Myth of the Noble Militia. In The Patriot, Mel Gibson leads a ragtag militia against the British, turning the American Revolution into a personal battle of vengeance. The truth? The revolution wasn't fought by a handful of passionate rebels seeking revenge. It was a carefully organized, politically driven movement for independence. The militia in the film is romanticized, portrayed as a heroic band of brothers fighting for freedom. In reality, the militia was often disorganized, fragmented, and lacked unity. Hollywood oversimplifies the reasons behind the war, reducing it to a personal vendetta rather than a complex ideological struggle for freedom and self-governance. The film's emotional power may captivate, but it sacrifices historical accuracy for drama, presenting a distorted view of the revolution's true motivations. But the cost of this distortion goes deeper than just the story of one man. Chapter 4: The Trojan War. Troy and the Fall of a City. Troy turns the epic Trojan War into a tale of vengeance and personal grudges, especially through the character of Achilles. In the film, he is depicted as a brooding hero driven by revenge against Hector, but the truth is much more complicated. The war wasn't just about one man's anger, it was a larger conflict between gods, kings, and destiny. Hollywood simplifies Achilles' character into a tragic anti-hero, focusing on his emotions rather than the deeper moral lessons of pride, fate, and hubris present in the myth. The real story of Troy was not just about heroic battles, it was about the clash of human ambition with divine will, where every action had a greater consequence. But Hollywood's version left out the most important parts: tensions between the gods and the inevitability of the war's tragic end. Chapter 5: The Gladiator's Gladiator and the Rise of the Hero in Gladiator. Maximus is portrayed as a noble gladiator fighting for vengeance after his family's brutal murder. The truth? Gladiators in ancient Rome were not just slaves seeking justice, they were professional fighters, often treated as entertainers, not warriors bent on personal revenge. Hollywood romanticizes the life of gladiators, turning it into a heroic struggle for freedom. In reality, gladiatorial combat was a brutal, organized spectacle where fighters were often forced to participate for the sake of public entertainment. These men were trained for combat, and their lives were less about rebellion and more about surviving in a world built on violence. The film's emotional narrative of vengeance overshadows the real grim nature of the gladiatorial games, turning them into a tale of personal triumph. Next, we'll explore how the Alamo's tragic story was turned into a myth of heroic sacrifice. Chapter 6: The Alamo. The Alamo and the heroic last stand. Hollywood has long romanticized the Battle of the Alamo, depicting a small group of heroes making a brave last stand against the Mexican army. But the truth? The real story was far more complex. While the defenders fought valiantly, their actions were not solely about heroic martyrdom, they were part of a larger, politically charged conflict for Texan independence. Hollywood focuses on the individual bravery of figures like Davy Crockett and Jim Bowie, turning the event into a myth of self-sacrifice. In reality, the Alamo was a strategic military position, and its fall was part of a larger campaign for control of Texas. The true story is lost in favor of a simplistic narrative of good versus evil. This distorted portrayal has lasted for generations, turning the battle into an icon of American patriotism. But the Alamo's real significance was about much more than heroism. It was a turning point in a complex struggle for independence. Chapter 7: The Roman Empire Gladiator and the Corrupt Emperor in Gladiator. Commodus is portrayed as a tyrannical emperor who murders his father to take the throne. But the truth? Commodus' reign was much more nuanced. While he certainly had moments of cruelty, he also brought periods of peace and stability to Rome. Hollywood turns him into a villainous caricature, making his rise to power seem like a personal quest for control. In reality, Commodus was a ruler with significant political challenges, including his attempts to secure power in a divided empire. His reign wasn't just about bloodlust, it was about the complexities of leadership in an era of turmoil. This oversimplification of Commodus' character turns a complex historical figure into a one-dimensional villain. The real story? It's about an emperor trying and often failing to maintain control in a crumbling empire. Chapter 8: The Spanish Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition and the Dark Age of Persecution. The Spanish Inquisition has long been portrayed in Hollywood films as a period of unrelenting religious persecution, where innocent people were tortured and burned at the stake. But the truth? While the Inquisition was certainly brutal, Hollywood exaggerates its scope, turning it into a singular event of horrific torture and mass persecution. The reality is more complicated. The Inquisition was part of a broader, politically motivated effort to maintain control over religious and social order in Spain. It wasn't just about religious zealots punishing heretics, it was tied to the monarchy's drive for unity and stability. Hollywood's portrayal of the Inquisition as a nightmarish, all-encompassing force strips away the historical context, making it seem like an isolated, irrational act of persecution. The true story is far more layered, reflecting the political and social complexities of medieval Europe. Chapter 9: The Life of Mozart Amadeus and the Romanticization of Genius in Amadeus. Mozart is depicted as a childish, crude genius, an image that overshadows his true character. While the film focuses on his supposed rivalry with Salieri, The reality is that Mozart was a disciplined, hard-working composer who struggled with both financial problems and personal setbacks. Hollywood's version turns him into a misunderstood, tortured artist, while the real Mozart was a driven professional who spent his life composing some of the greatest works in Western classical music. The rivalry with Salieri? That's more fiction than fact. This romanticized portrayal of Mozart as a reckless genius distorts the truth of his life. The reality? He was a man who faced immense struggles, including poverty and criticism, all while creating masterpieces that would last for centuries. Chapter 10. Spartacus, and the Misunderstanding of Slave Revolts Stanley. Kubrick's Spartacus paints the story of a slave leading a rebellion against the Roman Empire, but Hollywood oversimplifies the true nature of the revolt. The film turns Spartacus into a symbol of heroic resistance, but the real revolt was not as organized or noble as it seems on screen. Spartacus' uprising was swiftly crushed, and its impact on Roman society was minimal. The film focuses on a romanticized vision of freedom and rebellion, but in reality, the revolt was poorly organized and lacked widespread support. It was a brief, tragic chapter in Roman history. Hollywood's version of Spartacus as a valiant hero undermines the historical complexity of the situation. The real Spartacus was a leader of a desperate, disorganized group of slaves fighting for survival, not a legendary freedom fighter. Chapter 11. The D-Day Landing Saving Private Ryan and the Misrepresentation of War Saving Private Ryan opens with the harrowing D-Day landing, showcasing the brutal violence of the event. But Hollywood's portrayal is far from the full truth. While the film accurately captures the chaos of battle, it omits crucial details about the strategic planning and immense logistical effort that made D-Day possible. The film's focus is on personal heroism and individual struggle, while glossing over the larger coordinated effort between Allied forces that made the invasion successful. The scale of cooperation, from air superiority to intelligence gathering, was far more important than the emotional moments portrayed on screen. Hollywood's emphasis on gritty combat may pull at the heartstrings, but it distorts the collective nature of this monumental operation. The true story is about teamwork, strategy, and sacrifice, not just the heroics of one man. Chapter 12. The Medieval Knight. A Knight's Tale and the Fabrication of Chivalry in A Knight's Tale. Medieval knights are portrayed as swashbuckling heroes, jousting for glory and honor. But the truth about knightly life was far more grounded in reality. Knights didn't spend their days in epic tournaments. They were part of a feudal system, bound by duty to their lords and required to fight in bloody wars. Hollywood glamorizes their lives, turning them into romantic figures of chivalry. The reality was more about survival, political maneuvering, and the harsh realities of medieval warfare. The code of chivalry? It wasn't followed by all knights, and certainly didn't look as glamorous as portrayed in the film. This distortion of the knightly ideal leads to a simplified, romanticized version of the Middle Ages. It strips away the brutality and real social structures that defined medieval life. Chapter 13. The Mexican Revolution, Viva Zapata, and the heroic oversimplification in Viva Zapata. The Mexican Revolution is reduced to a simple tale of one man's heroic battle for justice. But the truth? The revolution was a complex struggle driven by a multitude of social, political, and economic factors. While Emiliano Zapata was a central figure, the film oversimplifies his role, turning him into a symbol of hope rather than a key part of a larger movement. Hollywood focuses on a singular vision of revolution, ignoring the internal divisions and diverse factions that fought for Mexico's future. The reality is that Zapata's revolution was not the only force at play. There were many competing ideologies at work. This oversimplified view of the revolution misleads audiences into thinking it was a battle for one man's vision, rather than a multifaceted struggle for change. Chapter 14. The Wild West. The Searchers and the misrepresentation of Native Americans in The Searchers, the Wild West is depicted as a place of constant violence, with Native Americans portrayed as savages attacking innocent settlers. But the truth? The dynamics of the American frontier were far more complex. Native American tribes weren't a monolithic enemy, but diverse cultures with their own complex social structures, values, and histories. Hollywood films like The Searchers often reduce Native Americans to mere villains in the story of westward expansion. The reality is, their land was taken through brutal policies and violent military campaigns, and they fought for survival in a rapidly changing world. The portrayal of Native Americans as the other fosters harmful stereotypes that persist to this day. Hollywood's version of the Wild West oversimplifies a violent, painful chapter in history, reducing it to a black-and-white narrative of good versus evil. Chapter 15: The Battle of Waterloo and the Misleading Napoleon. In the film Waterloo, Napoleon is shown as a tragic, almost heroic figure, whose downfall comes from personal flaws rather than the complexities of his reign. But the reality? Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo wasn't just about his arrogance or miscalculations. It was the result of numerous factors, including the combined might of European coalitions and strategic mistakes that had been building for years. Hollywood turns Napoleon into a victim of his own ego, but the truth is far more complicated. His empire was crumbling before Waterloo, and his defeat was inevitable. The battle itself was a massive, coordinated effort by the Allies, who had learned from past mistakes. By reducing Napoleon's downfall to one man's failure, Hollywood oversimplifies the complexities of European geopolitics. It strips away the real power dynamics that led to his defeat. Chapter 16: The French Revolution, Les Miserables, and the distortion of revolutionary ideals in Les Miserables. The French Revolution is portrayed as a grand tale of struggling citizens rising up against a corrupt aristocracy. But the truth? The revolution was far more chaotic and complex. The ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity were often overshadowed by violence, internal conflict, and power struggles between different factions. Hollywood's version simplifies the revolution into a moral battle between good and evil, with the downtrodden masses fighting for justice. But, in reality, the revolution was marked by terror, betrayal, and competing interests, leading to a rise of dictatorial power. The film romanticizes the revolution's heroes while ignoring the brutal realities of the Timean era of executions, political instability, and economic collapse. The true story is far messier, with a revolution that was not just about ideals, but about survival. Chapter 17: The Viking Invasions, the 13th Warrior and the Myth of Barbarian Warriors. In the 13th Warrior, the Vikings are depicted as brutal, bloodthirsty warriors, with a penchant for pillaging and raiding. But the truth? While Viking raids were certainly violent, the reality of Viking society was far more complex. They were skilled traders, explorers, and farmers, not just ruthless warriors looking to conquer and destroy. Hollywood simplifies the Viking experience into a barbaric fantasy, painting them as one-dimensional savages. In truth, Vikings built trade networks that spanned from the Americas to Asia, and their culture was rich in art, law, and diplomacy. By focusing solely on their raiding reputation, Hollywood distorts the true legacy of the Vikings, turning them into bloodthirsty caricatures. The real Vikings were far more multifaceted and contributed significantly to the world's cultural and economic landscape. Chapter 18: The Roman Empire, Ben-Hur, and the false depiction of ancient Rome in Ben-Hur, Ancient Rome, is portrayed as a brutal, decadent empire, where the power struggle between individuals determines the fate of the empire. But the truth? Rome's power was not solely dictated by personal vendettas. It was about a system of governance that balanced military strength, political manipulation, and social order. Hollywood's version of Rome focuses on personal dramas and revenge, overlooking the empire's complex political structure. The reality was that Rome was built on alliances, strategies, and a highly organized system that stretched across vast territories. By turning Rome into a stage for personal conflict, Ben-Hur oversimplifies the empire's grandeur and undermines its true political and military genius. The cost of this distortion is a loss of understanding about how empires functioned in the ancient world. Chapter 19, The Crusades, Kingdom of Heaven, and the Simplification of Religious Wars in Kingdom of Heaven. The Crusades are framed as a battle between good Christians and evil Muslims, with a righteous knight fighting for justice. But the truth? The Crusades were far more complicated, driven not just by religious zeal, but by political, economic, and territorial ambitions. Hollywood simplifies the Crusades into a clear-cut narrative of religious warfare, while ignoring the complex factors that motivated both sides. The reality was that both Christian and Muslim leaders used the conflict as a means to consolidate power, control resources, and expand empires. By reducing the Crusades to a black-and-white battle between good and evil, Hollywood distorts the true nature of these wars and perpetuates dangerous oversimplifications about religious conflict. The cost? A misunderstanding of one of history's most impactful and multifaceted events. Chapter 20, The Story of Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves and the Invention of Heroism in Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. The legendary outlaw is turned into a swashbuckling hero, fighting for justice against a corrupt sheriff of Nottingham. But the truth? Robin Hood's story was rooted in myth, not historical fact, and the tales were more about folklore than a single man's quest for revenge. Hollywood's version of Robin Hood turns him into a folk hero, a man of the people, leading a band of merry men against tyranny. But the real story? It was about the complex relationships between the Anglo-Saxon peasantry and the Norman rulers during the medieval period. Far less about individual heroism and more about social and political struggle. By turning Robin Hood into an iconic hero, Hollywood simplifies and distorts the deeper messages of social justice embedded in the legend. The real story was not about one man's fight for justice, it was about the tension between two cultures and the fight for power. Chapter 21, The Confederate South Gone with the Wind, and the Myth of the Old South Gone with the Wind, paints the story of the Confederacy as a noble cause, with heroic Southern belles and valiant soldiers. But the truth? The reality of the South during the Civil War was much more brutal and entrenched in slavery. Hollywood romanticizes a time when the South was not just about Southern pride, but a system that relied on the oppression of millions. The film's portrayal of Scarlett O'Hara and her struggles fails to show the true horrors of slavery and the oppression faced by African Americans. Instead, it creates a nostalgic, almost fairy tale version of the antebellum South, where the South's defeat is portrayed as a tragic loss, but not necessarily the end of a deeply unjust system. Hollywood's distortion of the Confederacy's legacy has real-world consequences. By glamorizing the Old South, it misrepresents the reality of slavery and the Civil War's true causes. Chapter 22, The First World War, All Quiet on the Western Front, and the misrepresentation of soldiers in All Quiet on the Western Front. World War I is depicted as a brutal, senseless conflict that leaves soldiers broken and disillusioned. While the horror of trench warfare is accurately captured, the film fails to delve into the broader political context of the war. The film reduces the war to a personal tragedy, missing the larger historical significance. Hollywood's focus on individual soldiers suffering oversimplifies the complex web of alliances, imperial ambitions, and nationalistic fervor that led to the war. The soldiers weren't just victims of a senseless war. They were pawns in a global political struggle that spanned decades. This simplification has a lasting impact on how we view history. By focusing so heavily on the emotional pain of the soldiers, All Quiet on the Western Front overlooks the larger factors that shaped the war's devastation. Chapter 23, The American Civil War Glory, and the Oversimplification of Black Soldiers' Role Glory, presents the story of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, one of the first all-black Union regiments, as a tale of bravery and sacrifice. While the regiment's courage was real, Hollywood's portrayal oversimplifies the complex realities black soldiers faced. In truth, black soldiers were often met with skepticism, inadequate supplies, and poor treatment, even by their own comrades. The film focuses on the heroism of the 54th, but fails to fully capture the struggle for black soldiers to gain acceptance and recognition. The reality was that they were fighting not just for freedom, but for their right to serve as equals. Hollywood's narrative of the regiment's bravery doesn't fully address the systemic racism black soldiers faced. By focusing on individual valor, it leaves out the broader context of racial inequality that was central to the Civil War. Chapter 24: The Life of Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln and the myth of political genius. Lincoln portrays the 16th president as a calm, composed genius, single-handedly steering the nation through the Civil War. But the truth? Lincoln was a political operator, constantly navigating a web of alliances, backroom deals, and difficult compromises to keep the Union together. While Lincoln's leadership during the war was remarkable, Hollywood's portrayal simplifies his story, turning him into an almost saintly figure. The reality is that his presidency was marked by political struggles, personal doubts, and hard decisions. Hollywood's version of Lincoln as a flawless leader distorts the true complexity of his presidency. By focusing on the great man narrative, it overlooks the political wrangling and compromises that defined his leadership style. Chapter 25: The Life of Genghis Khan. Mongol and the exaggerated conquest in Mongol. Genghis Khan is portrayed as a tragic hero, rising from humble beginnings to become one of the most feared conquerors in history. But the truth? Genghis Khan's rise to power was not just about personal ambition, it was about the violent unification of the Mongol tribes through conquest and bloodshed. While the film focuses on his personal story and romanticizes his rise, it downplays the brutality of his campaigns. Genghis Khan was responsible for the deaths of millions as he expanded his empire across Asia, leaving a path of destruction in his wake. Hollywood's version turns him into a sympathetic figure, downplaying the extreme violence and suffering caused by his empire building. By focusing on the man and not the empire, the film creates a distorted legacy of a conqueror who was far more ruthless than portrayed. Chapter 26: The Battle of Agincourt. Henry V and the fictionalization of English victory in Henry V. The Battle of Agincourt is depicted as an overwhelming English victory, where King Henry leads his outnumbered troops to triumph. The truth? While Agincourt was a significant victory, the reality is far more complex. The English army was aided by heavy rain and the mud, which rendered the French cavalry ineffective, giving the English an unexpected advantage. Hollywood turns the battle into a heroic, underdog story of a king defying the odds, when in truth, the outcome was more a result of chance than brilliant strategy. The film glorifies Henry's leadership, but overlooks the key factors that contributed to the victory, including French tactical errors and mismanagement. By focusing on personal heroism, Henry V distorts the battle's true context, oversimplifying the reality of medieval warfare. The cost of this distortion: a romanticized view of a military victory that was more about luck than legendary leadership. Chapter 27: The Cold War. The Hunt for Red October and the misunderstanding of Soviet culture. In The Hunt for Red October, the Soviet Union is portrayed as a menacing, monolithic enemy, with cold, calculating leaders who engage in a tense game of cat and mouse with the United States. But the truth? The Soviet Union was a complex state, riddled with internal struggles and not always driven by the diabolical intentions Hollywood suggests. The film focuses on the intrigue and personal heroism of the American and Russian characters, but it oversimplifies the Cold War. The reality was A decades-long ideological battle between two superpowers, fueled by politics, paranoia, and economic struggles, not just military tension. Hollywood's portrayal of the Soviets as a unified, evil empire ignores the deep divisions within the USSR and the challenges it faced at home. By reducing it to a simple conflict, the film distorts the nuanced reality of Cold War geopolitics. Chapter 28: The Fall of the Berlin Wall. The Lives of Others and the Overemphasis on Oppression. The Lives of Others shows the oppressive East German regime as a dark, monolithic force controlling its citizens, culminating in the fall of the Berlin Wall. While the reality of East German surveillance and repression was horrific, Hollywood's portrayal overemphasizes the role of individual heroes, turning the wall's fall into a personal narrative of resistance. The truth? The fall of the Berlin Wall was the result of a complex set of factors: economic collapse, political pressures, and public disillusionment with the regime. It wasn't just about one man's moral choice, it was the culmination of a broad systemic failure. Hollywood's focus on personal sacrifice and individual action distorts the broader, collective nature of this historic event. It simplifies a complex political transformation into an emotional, personal struggle. Chapter 29: The Alcatraz Escape. Escape from Alcatraz and the Invention of Legend. Escape from Alcatraz presents the daring breakout of 3 prisoners from the notorious federal prison as a brilliant, almost flawless escape. But the truth? The escape was much less glamorous. While it remains unsolved, the escapees' chances of success were slim, and there is no evidence they ever made it out of the bay alive. Hollywood's version glorifies the escape, turning it into a legendary story of ingenuity and defiance. In reality, it was an audacious attempt by desperate men, and the chances of survival were incredibly low. The escape was not a well-executed, heroic triumph, but an act of extreme desperation. This myth-making distorts the grim reality of life in Alcatraz, turning it into an exciting tale of perseverance. By focusing on the escape, Hollywood overlooks the true nature of the prison and its infamous history. Chapter 30: The Civil Rights Movement, Selma, and the Simplification of Racial Struggles. Selma presents the March on Selma as a key turning point in the civil rights movement, focusing on Martin Luther King Jr.'s leadership and the emotional power of the march. While the film captures the powerful moment, it oversimplifies the decades of struggle and activism that led to this event. Hollywood's version focuses on a singular moment of triumph, but it ignores the long history of grassroots activism, protests, and the everyday people who fought for civil rights before and after Selma. The march was important, but it was not the whole story. By reducing the movement to a few key figures and events, Hollywood fails to fully capture the complexities of the civil rights struggle. The true battle was fought in communities across the country, and it took more than one march to bring change. Chapter 31: The Great Fire of London. The Great Fire and the distortion of historical facts. In the Great Fire, the catastrophic blaze that ravaged London in 1666 is shown as a dramatic struggle between the city's residents and the fire itself. But the truth? While the fire was devastating, Hollywood oversimplifies the causes and the aftermath. The film focuses heavily on individual heroism, while ignoring the socio-political and architectural factors that contributed to the fire's rapid spread. The fire was exacerbated by London's overcrowded wooden buildings and narrow streets, but the film doesn't explore the role of city planning, nor does it reflect the mixed reactions of the authorities. Rather than a story of individual courage, the real narrative is about a city struggling to rebuild itself amidst a crumbling infrastructure. Hollywood's version reduces a complex disaster to a tale of personal survival. By focusing on characters, the film erases the larger issues that made the fire so devastating. Chapter 32: The Battle of Gettysburg, and the Oversimplification of Civil War Strategy. In Gettysburg, the battle is depicted as a heroic clash of ideals, with the Confederate forces led by Robert E. Lee fighting for honor and freedom against the Union's quest to preserve the nation. But the truth? The Battle of Gettysburg was not just about moral ideals. It was about tactical blunders, poor communication, and a series of costly mistakes on both sides. Hollywood's portrayal focuses heavily on the personal stories of soldiers, while glossing over the strategic complexity that shaped the outcome. The Union's victory was not as clean-cut as the film suggests. It was marked by confusion, missed opportunities, and sheer luck. The battle was not a simple good versus evil scenario, but Hollywood's version of the story creates a misleading, simplified narrative. By focusing on personal heroism, the film ignores the larger strategic context that defined the battle. Chapter 33: The Conquest of the Americas, the New World, and the Rewriting of History. The New World romanticizes the encounter between European settlers and Native Americans, focusing on the relationship between John Smith and Pocahontas. But the truth? The real story of the conquest of the Americas is far more tragic and complicated. The film presents a sanitized version of early colonization, glossing over the violence and exploitation that defined much of European expansion. Hollywood simplifies the cultural exchange between Native Americans and Europeans, portraying it as a peaceful encounter rather than a clash of civilizations. The film overlooks the mass displacement, disease, and genocide that followed the arrival of Europeans. By romanticizing the early days of colonization, the New World distorts the reality of what happened to indigenous peoples. It creates a false narrative of mutual understanding, erasing the real suffering caused by European expansion. Chapter 34: The Rape of Nanking and the Hollywood Treatment of Atrocities in Nanking. Hollywood attempts to depict the brutal Japanese invasion of China, focusing on the horrific atrocities committed by soldiers during the Nanking Massacre. While the film does capture some of the reality, it risks oversimplifying the causes and broader context of the massacre, turning it into an emotionally charged spectacle. Hollywood often portrays atrocities like Nanking with a focus on individual acts of heroism and survival, but this reduces the scale of the event and the political realities that allowed it to happen. The film's emotional narrative makes the tragedy feel like an isolated incident, rather than part of a larger, horrific pattern of war crimes. By focusing on the personal stories of a few individuals, the film risks trivializing the horror of the event and undermining the systematic nature of the massacre. Chapter 35: The Battle of Thermopylae 300 and the Distortion of Spartan Society in 300. The Battle of Thermopylae is depicted as a heroic stand by 300 Spartan warriors against the Persian Empire. While the real battle was a legendary act of courage, Hollywood exaggerates the Spartans' role and simplifies their society into a black-and-white morality tale. The truth? The Spartans were not just elite warriors, they were part of a rigid militarized society that relied heavily on slavery and extreme discipline. Hollywood's version of Spartan society glorifies their courage while ignoring the brutal, oppressive nature of their way of life. Hollywood turns the battle into a mythic clash between good and evil, with the Spartans as noble warriors fighting for freedom. In reality, the war was about empire building, and the Persian forces weren't simply evil, they were driven by their own expansionist ambitions. Chapter 36: The Life of Queen Victoria, the Young Victoria, and the Misrepresentation of a Monarch. The Young Victoria portrays the early years of Queen Victoria's reign as a fairy tale romance, focusing on her love story with Prince Albert and her struggle to assert her authority. While it's true that Victoria had a deep love for Albert, Hollywood's version simplifies her story into a personal drama, ignoring the political complexities of her reign. In reality, Victoria was a monarch who navigated the challenging political landscape of 19th century Britain. Her reign wasn't just about romanceit, was about maintaining power in an era when monarchs were increasingly symbolic and less involved in daily governance. She had to balance the demands of the British Parliament, manage her relationships with European monarchs, and guide her country through profound social and industrial changes. Hollywood's portrayal reduces Queen Victoria to a passive figure, driven more by love than by her political savvy and determination. By focusing on her personal life, the film overlooks the strength of her leadership and the difficult decisions she faced as a ruler. Hollywood's oversimplification of her life has consequences. It diminishes her true legacy as a powerful and influential monarch. In the next chapter, we explore the myth of the Battle of the Bulge, Chapter 37. The Battle of the Bulge, and the Hollywood misunderstanding of World War II in Battle of the Bulge. The epic struggle between the Allies and Nazi Germany during the final stages of World War II is presented as a heroic, clear-cut victory for the American forces. However, Hollywood simplifies the brutal complexity of the battle, focusing on the emotional triumph of soldiers without conveying the larger strategic and military importance of the conflict. The truth? The Battle of the Bulge was one of the largest and most brutal engagements of the war, with massive casualties on both sides. The Allies were caught off guard by the surprise German offensive, and it took several weeks of intense combat to repel the enemy. It wasn't just about the personal heroism of individual soldiers, it was a grueling strategic struggle that required immense coordination and resilience. Hollywood's portrayal turns the battle into a more straightforward narrative, glossing over the heavy losses and the confusion that defined it. By focusing on the emotional elements of the conflict, the film distorts the true cost and complexity of the battle. But Hollywood wasn't done rewriting history. Up next, we look at the myth of The Last Samurai, Chapter 38. The Last Samurai, and the romanticization of Japanese culture. The Last Samurai presents the story of an American soldier, played by Tom Cruise, who finds himself embracing the samurai way of life in 19th century Japan. While the film showcases the beauty and discipline of samurai culture, it distorts the historical reality by focusing on the individual, heroic journey of a foreigner rather than the deeper cultural conflicts of the time. In reality, the samurai were not just noble warriors, they were part of a feudal system that was quickly becoming obsolete as Japan modernized. The film fails to capture the tension between tradition and modernization, which was at the heart of Japan's Meiji Restoration. The samurai's struggle was not just about personal honor, it was about the fight to preserve an ancient way of life in the face of a rapidly changing world. Hollywood's focus on an American outsider romanticizes Japan's transition from feudalism to a modern nation, downplaying the internal complexities and struggles of Japanese society. By creating a hero out of a foreign soldier, The Last Samurai distorts the true history of Japan's transformation. Next, we'll dive into the women's suffrage movement and how Hollywood ignored key figures in Suffragette Chapter 39, the women's suffrage movement Suffragette. And the erasure of key figures Suffragette tells the story of the British women's fight for the right to vote, focusing on the personal journey of Maud Watts, a fictional character. While the film highlights the struggles of working-class women, it oversimplifies the movement and overlooks the contributions of key historical figures who were integral to the suffrage cause. The film focuses on the emotional journey of one woman, yet it doesn't fully represent the diverse voices and efforts that made the suffrage movement a reality. Many key figures like Emmeline Pankhurst, the leader of the Women's Social and Political Union, are sidelined or barely mentioned. The true story of the suffrage movement was one of collective action, spanning decades and involving people from all walks of life, not just a handful of individuals. By focusing on a fictional character, Suffragette distorts the broader historical context of the movement. The film's emotional arc takes precedence over the political realities and diverse contributions that led to women winning the vote. And Hollywood's oversimplification of history doesn't end here. In the next chapter, we'll see how Midway misrepresented the Battle of Midway, Chapter 40, the Battle of Midway, and the heroic oversimplification of naval strategy in Midway. The decisive naval battle of World War II is presented as a heroic showdown between the American and Japanese forces, where individual acts of bravery turn the tide of war. However, this Hollywood version of the battle oversimplifies the complexities of naval warfare and the strategic planning behind the victory. The truth? The Battle of Midway was a result of brilliant intelligence work and strategic planning, not just a series of heroic moments. The Americans had cracked Japanese codes, allowing them to anticipate the attack and prepare accordingly. The battle was won not by chance or bravery alone, but by meticulous planning and the use of intelligence. Hollywood focuses on the emotional moments and individual heroism, glossing over the significance of strategy and luck. By turning Midway into a story of personal glory, Midway distorts the true nature of the battle, which was a turning point in the Pacific War, not just a moment of individual heroism. Next, we look at how the aviator misrepresented the history of aviation. Chapter 40, the Civil Rights Movement. Selma and the Simplification of Racial Struggles. Selma presents the March on Selma as a key turning point in the Civil Rights Movement, focusing on Martin Luther King Jr.'s leadership and the emotional power of the march. While the film captures the powerful moment, it oversimplifies the decades of struggle and activism that led to this event. Hollywood's version focuses on a singular moment of triumph, but it ignores the long history of grassroots activism, protests, and the everyday people who fought for civil rights before and after Selma. The march was important, but it was not the whole story. By reducing the movement to a few key figures and events, Hollywood fails to fully capture the complexities of the civil rights struggle. The true battle was fought in communities across the country, and it took more than one march to bring change. Chapter 41, the invention of flight. The Aviator and the distorted history of aviation. In The Aviator, Howard Hughes is portrayed as a visionary genius who revolutionized aviation. While Hughes did make significant contributions to the field, Hollywood takes considerable liberties with his life, turning him into a larger-than-life figure driven by personal demons rather than focusing on the full context of aviation history. The truth? Hughes was not the sole pioneer of flight, as the film suggests. His accomplishments, while impressive, were part of a much broader collaborative effort in aviation, and his eccentricities often highlighted in the film overshadow the work of many other pioneers who contributed to the field. The films focus on Hughes' personal struggles with obsessive-compulsive disorder, and his extravagant lifestyle leads audiences to believe that his innovations were driven solely by his mental battles. Hollywood's portrayal of Hughes as a tortured genius creates a distorted narrative of aviation history. It overlooks the contributions of others like the Wright brothers and Amelia Earhart, who also shaped the aviation landscape. Chapter 42, The Crusades. The Lionheart and the Creation of Heroic Myths. The Lionheart presents the Crusades as a battle between good Christian knights and evil Muslim invaders, focusing on the chivalric heroism of Richard the Lionheart. While the film portrays Richard as a heroic figure fighting for justice, the reality of the Crusades was much more complicated. The truth? The Crusades were not just about religious fervor. They were driven by a mixture of political, economic, and territorial ambitions. Richard's personal glory was far less important than the larger geopolitical motives that fueled the wars. The Crusades were about expanding European power, controlling key territories, and securing wealth through religious wars. Hollywood's version simplifies the Crusades into a tale of Christian knights fighting for righteous causes, while overlooking the complexities of the time. It reduces a series of brutal, violent conflicts into a black-and-white morality play, ignoring the motivations of all the factions involved. Chapter 43, The Battle of Custer's Last Stand. Little Big Man and the Rewriting of Native American History. In Little Big Man, The Battle of Custer's Last Stand is depicted as a tragic but heroic stand by Native Americans against the American cavalry. While the film aims to humanize the Native American experience, it distorts historical facts to make Custer's defeat a more dramatic and personal story of resistance. The truth? The battle was not about a heroic stand for freedom. It was a clash between a well-organized, highly disciplined force and an overconfident, ill-prepared American army. General Custer made several strategic errors that led to his death, and the battle was less about a moral struggle and more about the military realities of the time. Hollywood's romanticized version of Native American resistance makes it seem like the battle was a heroic, righteous victory. In reality, Custer's defeat was an inevitable consequence of his poor leadership and the overwhelming forces of the Native American tribes united against him. Chapter 44. The History of Pirates, Pirates of the Caribbean, and the Fantasy of Piracy. Pirates of the Caribbean is a fun, swashbuckling adventure, but it distorts the true nature of piracy in the golden age of piracy. The film presents pirates as charismatic anti-heroes, leading daring adventures on the high seas. But the reality of piracy was far more brutal and less glamorous. The truth? Pirates were not romantic freedom fighters. They were criminals who preyed on merchants' ships, and coastal settlements. Life as a pirate was harsh, filled with violence, disease, and constant fear of being captured or killed. The Pirates of the Caribbean were less about treasure hunts and more about surviving violent, dangerous lives at sea. Hollywood's portrayal of pirates as charming adventurers creates a false narrative that romanticizes their lifestyle. It turns piracy into a grand, heroic enterprise, while ignoring the lawlessness and brutality that defined it. Chapter 45. The Mexican-American War, the Alamo, and the fictionalization of Texas independence. In the Alamo, the battle for Texas independence is presented as a noble last stand by the Texian rebels against the overwhelming forces of Mexico. While the defense of the Alamo was undoubtedly significant, Hollywood turns the conflict into a heroic myth, ignoring the complex political motives behind the war. The truth? The war for Texas independence was not just a fight for freedom. It was about territorial expansion and the desire for more land. The Texians, many of whom had come from the U.S., wanted to establish a new, pro-slavery state that would align with American interests. The film's portrayal focuses on the romantic heroism of the Texian defenders, but overlooks the larger imperialistic and expansionist motives that fueled the war. Hollywood's version simplifies the battle into a good versus evil narrative, erasing the nuanced, politically charged motivations behind the conflict. By glorifying the Texian rebels, the film distorts the historical reality of the Mexican-American War. Final payoff: Hollywood's version of history isn't just about entertainment. It shapes how we understand the past and influences how we view the world today. By twisting facts, exaggerating heroes, and simplifying complex events, these fictionalized stories distort our perception of reality. The cost is far more than just a few historical inaccuracies. It leads to a society that misunderstands the complexities of the past, glorifies the wrong heroes, and erases the true struggles of those who fought for justice. The legends created by Hollywood are powerful, but they come with a price of distorted legacies, lost truths, and a skewed sense of history. As we've uncovered 45 historical facts invented by Hollywood, one thing is clear: the truth is far more fascinating and far more important. The real cost of these fictions is not just misinformation, but a misunderstanding of the very world we live in, and the real history, it's far more captivating than fiction.